I'm Joel Miller,
And I'm Jamie Bennett.
and this is Bad Books of the Bible.
It's a podcast about a collection of books with a curious pedigree and an even stranger legacy.
Last episode, we introduced the just and unjust man. We also looked at wisdom that drives one, that propels one, and flees, that is, runs away from the other. Along with that, we looked at the persecution that the just man experiences at the hand of the unjust man. And we also looked at the end of that. Again, this was from chapters 1 through 2 of the Book of Wisdom. And that second chapter ends with a conversation about death and the role that envy plays in the creation of death, in the origin of death. Today, we're going to be looking at chapters 3 through 4. And we'll start with the fate of the just man. So if you remember at the end of chapter 2, we have this progression from the persecution that the just man experiences to the consequences of the situation. And I want to turn as we go into chapter 3 to the fate of the just man. But before we do that, Jamie, any thoughts on chapters 1 through 2 as we're kind of recapping?
Yeah, I had a couple quick things. First of all, I think we've got to remember that these chapters are artificially put in later. So
Totally.
We can't have these episodes go on forever. At some point, we have to stop. And that was a neat place for us to stop. But the writer's building his argument. And
Yes.
So it's important that we keep that stuff in mind. So I wanted to just comment real quickly on envy and death, because I think it sets some of the stage for what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
For one thing, I did a little bit of a dive on envy. The Greek term there is phonos, and it's used about a dozen times in the Bible, more in the New Testament than the Old, but it is a few times in the Greek Old Testament. And I like how the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible defined it. They said classically it's defined as the inner pain or sadness one feels towards the good fortune of another.
Oh, wow.
But it's a little different than jealousy, right? Sometimes we make them synonymous.
Yeah.
But jealousy is more like wanting to acquire a comparable fortune, to emulate another one, that kind of thing. Whereas envy kind of can get malicious, almost wanting to rob blessings from the other.
Or just deprive, like you shouldn't have it, therefore I'll take it from you, or destroy it.
Right, exactly. And I think it's important to emphasize that, because there is this sort of two streams going throughout this book, and there's an animosity between the streams. And this, of course, manifests in the conversations about death. And I found this great quote from St. Ignatius of Antioch that I thought would kind of set the stage here. He says, "Two possibilities are laid open to us at the same time: life and death, and each person will come to the end that befits him. Life and death are like two types of coin. One belongs to God and the other to this world, each with its own hallmark. Unbelievers deal in the currency of this world, and those who have remained faithful through love carry the coin of God the Father, which is marked with Jesus Christ. If we are not ready to die for him or to imitate his passion, we will not have his life within us." And of course, this was written by St. Ignatius, who himself died for Jesus Christ. And
he is the just man, right? He's a great example of the just man that we covered last week. What an incredible quote.
And this is why he's remembered as a God bearer, right? It was in being that just man that he himself sort of bore God into this world in the marks of his life. So the contrast here between the righteous and the ungodly in this life cuts through all the way into death and beyond the grave.
Yeah. So as we're looking at that, you mentioned that the author's building his argument. I think that's really important to remember as we're listening to all of these chapters. We have these artificial breaks, these chapter breaks. We're covering basically 2 chapters every episode right up until the end. And what that means is we're going to be cutting and dropping the conversation, at these arbitrary points in some cases.
Yeah.
That's why, Jamie, you're bringing up the flow of the argument up to this point. I want to go ahead now and resume the argument at the beginning of chapter 3.
Please do.
Tell us a little bit about the fate of the just man.
Well, we see right away in verse 1 of chapter 3, the souls of the righteous are in the hands of God, and no torment will ever touch them.
Yeah.
There's this sense in which, like verse 3 says, the righteous dead are at peace. So there's a sense that in the immortality of living within God, that the just man's fate is secure, that he's going to abide in the kingdom of God no matter what.
Yeah.
And in fact, in verse 9, I love the way it puts it, the faithful will abide with him in love.
I have that flagged also to mention. There's, like you mentioned, these two streams and the animosity between them, because they are arguing from different premises, because they're operating from different standpoints in the world, wisdom versus folly, justice versus injustice, righteousness versus unrighteousness. There's like this perspectival difference that the author is presenting. The unjust sees the just man as suffering because he's inflicting pain on the just man.
Right.
But wisdom sees the just man at peace, even in the midst of being punished, even in the midst of being persecuted. And you mentioned, Ignatius of Antioch. He's the perfect example of this. But of course, all the martyrs are an example of this. The tormentor feels that they have the upper hand, that they are dealing a lesson, that they are being retributive in some way, or retributive, that they are being punishing in some way, that these folks are getting their just desserts for having deviated from the way or whatever. But in reality, the martyr is at peace. The martyr knows that things will be well, and the martyr somehow, despite the extremes of their circumstances, recognizes that they are, as the text says, in the hands of God, which is like an incredible witness, by the way, that this is in the quote unquote Old Testament, and yet it feels like you're reading something right out of like a martyr story from the New Testament.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think at points when looking at this to think of almost a little bit of Stoic philosophy.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I
kind of like baptized in a sense.
Absolutely. Like it's better than, right? But it's this resiliency in the face of whatever comes. And we're going to keep mentioning St. Ignatius, I guess, but I think of St. Ignatius on his way to Rome to be executed, and he actually wrote to the Romans, and I believe it was in his letter to the Romans that he was a little concerned that somebody would advocate for him and prevent him from going to his death.
They would try to spring him, and he's like, no, don't do it.
Do it.
This is my mission. This is my responsibility at this point. This is my opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I think it's also interesting that, not to jump too far ahead in the text, but in chapter 4, verse 10, it speaks of some who pleased God and were loved by him, and while living among sinners were taken up. So this has led, many to speculate whether this is a reference to Enoch or Elijah, who were essentially spirited away to God's presence before dying, and while living righteously. And, we sometimes think in terms of long life, and maybe we'll come back to this later, but like there is even a promise in the fourth commandment that if you honor your father and your mother, that you may live long in the land. So there is this hope for long life as sort of a sign of God's blessing. But here, and again, I think we'll come back to this later, and here we have this sense where even the righteous sometimes die younger, or in verse 10 of chapter 4, are taken away early in the midst of their righteousness. And there is a different way of seeing that Wisdom of Solomon pulls out.
It's like if you think about the way the world would normally work, obviously post the fall, this is broken to one degree. But even in the midst of that brokenness, long life, fruitful family, all of these things are signs of God's blessing. But if you kind of like break and twist and bend the world more than whatever we might call normal, the lack of those things, while they might be apparently part of discipline or apparently the withholding of God's goodness or something like that, the text here is actually arguing, no, even that is good. Even
Yeah.
that is okay. Even that is a blessing. Even that is a sign of God's presence or blessing in this person. Because as the world gets progressively twisted or broken, the kind of like normal signs of God's goodness and grace might be hard to see.
Yeah.
And the
Right.
author's making this argument that, and we'll see this actually as we keep going through these two chapters, especially as we look at the case of childlessness. The author is saying, no, even these things are signs of faithfulness.
Yeah.
And that's really important because sometimes we kind of judge God based on these experiences that we have, and particularly the exterior signs of those experiences. And so God's goodness or lack of goodness comes down to, well, we don't see something good happening here, or we don't see fruitfulness happening here. And in reality, the author is saying, okay, but look
Hmm.
behind the curtain here, and God is still operating. God is still good. God is still blessing faithfulness, even if the more traditional signs you would be used to seeing are not present because they've been snuffed out by the unbelief of the culture you're in.
Yeah. I think we are often forgetful because of our own culture, of the importance of virtue, right? And like we've almost gotten to the point where like the idea of a just man or a virtuous man, like we would just dismiss such a person as maybe prudish.
Right.
Like we're almost, it's almost like we've become prudes about the importance of virtue. uh, we become prudish about prudishness. uh,
Yeah.
but like to the
Like
writer of,
we're embarrassed by it somehow.
yeah, absolutely, virtue factors in very heavily to the writer of wisdom because it agrees with the divine wisdom that governs the cosmos. Gregory of Nyssa says, it is impossible to say which one of the forms of virtue is more important than all others, or if the practice of one ought to be preferred to that of others. He goes on later to say they are all of equal value. And I want to harp on this for just one quick second. And then we'll get back to the just man. He talks about all the virtues being sort of intertwined in the life of the just man. And so Gregory goes on to say, simplicity opens the way to obedience. Obedience leads to faith. Faith gives rise to hope, and hope inspires justice. Justice engenders a spirit of service, and a spirit of service ends in humility. It's a little more. Meekness of heart, which grows with humility, brings joy. Joy is the way to love, and love is prayer. In this way, the virtues, each one bound up with all, come together in the person who possesses them and leads the soul to the height of what it desires.
First off, that's beautiful. And Gregory is a poet as much as he is a theologian.
Yes, he is.
Um, that's fantastic. It also points out that the fruit of the spirit, the evidence of God's goodness working in you as goodness, is like a multi-front thing. You can't focus on just one. Like you go to the
Yeah.
gym, you're just going to work on your triceps or something. Uh, you're
It's
getting
tricep day.
right. You're getting all of it because they're mutually reinforcing, as he
Yeah,
says.
that's exactly it.
So this perspectival difference between the just and the unjust, um, what one person sees as persecution, the other experiences as God's chastisement or discipline. And verse 5 from chapter 3 says that God has tried them. And we know from other models in the Old Testament that, and the New as well, like Hebrews chapter 11, when you think about chastisement or testing or persecution or a trial, there is for the faithful an elevation at the end of that trial. And that's exactly what we find here. And there's a beautiful word picture given in verse 7 to describe this elevation at the end. The author refers to the just man coming through this chastisement like sparks in the stubble. They will fly in all directions. Like
Mm,
they will be illuminated. They will and they will soar. And right after that, there's a reference to their elevation into the role of judgment so that they will judge the nations, which, again, this is fascinating that this is coming in this Old Testament book, and yet that is very clearly paralleled in Revelation chapter 20, verse 4. So in the book of wisdom, it talks about the just man judging the nations. And I'm going to go ahead and just read Revelation chapter 20. Then I saw some thrones, and I saw those thrones who are given the power to be judges, to take their seats on them. I saw the souls of all who had been beheaded for having witnessed for Jesus and for having preached God's word, and those who refused to worship the beast or his statue and would not have the brand mark on their foreheads or hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. In other words, they're talking about the same thing. These two authors, separated by however many decades, if not a century or so, are referring to the same basic truth, which is that by holding faithful to the revelation that's given by God, the righteous, the just, the wise will be elevated into some sense of judging the nations. And it's
Yeah.
pictured just as clearly here in the book of wisdom as it is in the book of Revelation.
That's really powerful, and I think it connects with Orthodox Christian theology, particularly or eschatology when we're talking about the angels and the saints, and all of that ties in. At the very least, though, I couldn't help but think like that's a high elevation.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, at a lower level, it describes the just being like a whole burnt offering to God.
Wow. I know. I saw that and I was like, holy cow.
So it's like our life becomes a sacrifice, and in being consumed, what rises up to God is accepted and wonderful. And like, I'm going to get a little evangelical here, but I thought of Keith Green,
Yeah.
and his make my life a prayer to you. I want to do what you want me to. No empty words, no white lies, no token prayers, no compromise.
Right.
But like, that's the just man in this text is offering his whole life as if it's a burnt offering.
Well,
And
don't
then
we see that in the New Testament with St. Paul talking about our reasonable service? Like, this is a
yeah,
sacrifice that
living
a
sacrifice.
living sacrifice. Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of incredible to contemplate, but those connections are right there.
Yeah.
A moment ago, you talked about the text referring to the just abiding with God in love. That's a really beautiful picture of the kind of the end, the final state of the just. The unjust man, however, experiences rather a different kind of fate. And like verse 10 of chapter 3 refers to the punishment tailored to their scheme that they will achieve. And I can't help but think about that quote that you started with, St. Ignatius, on referring to the godly coin and the worldly coin. There is a commensurateness of the kind of end experience of the good and the ungood, of the just and the unjust, of the righteous and the unrighteous, the wise and the unwise, that the punishment is tailored to their scheme. There is like a rightness to the wrongness that the
Right.
unjust experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Like there's the way it's described. Like the unjust, they're dejected, they're unhappy. Life is full of failures. Suffering is pointless. Like, he's building quite a contrast here.
Yeah.
In fact, I like how the Navarre Bible puts it. It describes it as no hope on their horizon, no relief from their anguish. To compound their misfortunes, their family life will go awry. Their bad example will lead to their wives to behave foolishly and their children to go astray. Like, it's not good. Like, God's laughing at them. There's no glory.
Yeah.
They're going to become corpses. even the dead are going to mock them.
That close, chapter 3, verse 11, the close of this little bit here, this passage. I mean, here's a reading of it out of the Anchor Bible. Empty are such men's hopes, their efforts unavailing, their deeds futile, their wives are frantic, their children worthless, their lineage a curse.
Oh,
I mean, ow. I mean, that's
yeah,
like, like we talked before about all these signs of goodness, like having been deprived, the good are no longer experiencing them because of the persecution that they're feeling. Like there's no outward sign that they're blessed. Well, here the author is saying all these outward signs of blessing that the worldly have are not actually a blessing. Like their efforts are futile. Their children are like, they're not a benefit to them. Like all the good things that they have are actually bad.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the primary application here, I want to make a comment that is going to deviate from this, but I think the primary application here, right, is for us to apply this in our lives, and to see where this reflects us and areas where we can repent. But in light of that, I mean, also we got to think about the historical context in which this was written. I think we said this was probably one of the last books of the Old Testament, if not the last book of the Old Testament, as far as time of writing. So it's situated right in there in that period where many Jewish people had kind of been Hellenized. They'd had this heavy Greek influence. And when we went through Maccabees, we talked about that a lot. And there were a lot of growing pains for God's people in that time. And so since, this book is written ostensibly to the nations, it's really going to be read by the Jews first and then later by Christians. And so I couldn't help but think maybe, some of these things were almost an internal message to fellow Jews, Jews who'd been influenced by the world, and like setting up a contrast here to remind them what they're ultimately called to.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, one thing I like about that point is it's important to remember that when we talk about the just and the unjust, when we talk about the wise and the foolish, when we talk about any of these things, we're not talking about static categories. We talked before about being kind of stuck in the middle, and the audience for this book is stuck in the middle in the sense that they have a choice to make. You and I have a choice to make. The listener has a choice to make at every juncture along the way of life. Are you going to choose one path or the other path? And it's important to remember that, because it would be really easy to kind of sit there self-satisfied in a self-satisfied way and say, well, I'm one of the righteous, I'm one of the kingdom, I'm, whatever, I'm one of the called, I'm one of the elect. And then kind of just think that all the good things it's talking about are yours and all the bad things are some other guy's problem.
Right.
But that would not be in the spirit of the book, nor obviously in the spirit of the entire witness of the scripture. You are choosing to follow one path or the other path. And a book like this is meant to be formative in those choices, in the sense that it's guiding you, it's coaching you, it's leading you to be wise, but you could still be an idiot. You could still be a fool. I could still be a fool. And this book is not saying, like those idiots over here or those good people over here. It's looking at me, it's looking at you, and it's saying, are you going to be the idiot, or are you going to be righteous? Are you going to be the fool, or are you going to be wise? And so when you talk about applying it to yourself, I mean, that is exactly what this thing is meant to do, and how we should be approaching all of these kinds of books, but certainly this book.
Yeah, it strikes me that as long as we're in these mortal bodies, the case is not closed. The door is open, and the path in front of us, we have to choose to stay on that path. And our Orthodox listeners will know this prayer, but I think all will appreciate this. I was thinking of the prayer where we ask God for a Christian ending to our life, painless and blameless. Like, it's not a done deal yet. If we are still in these mortal bodies, then that is an appropriate prayer, because we want to not only be on the path now, but we want to stay on that path to the end.
Right. Blameless is an interesting thing to remember there, because it would be more, it would be easier to focus on painless, like as,
Right.
as
Who
you
wants to die
imagine,
in pain?
right? As you imagine death, you kind of want it to be peaceful. That's the way we think about it. But in that very, again, formative, instructive coaching prayer, it's saying painless and blameless.
Yeah.
And those two things are equally important.
Yeah.
So chapter 3 ends with this situation in which the children of the unjust are quote unquote worthless, that the legacy that they have, the lineage, is a curse, not a blessing.
Yeah.
And children kind of become like a case study in the next chapter, in chapter 4. There's a brief mention of this at the end of chapter 3. We have chapter 3 verse 13. It mentions, blessed indeed is the barren woman who is unstained, who has not gone to bed in sin. She shall be fruitful at the great assize of souls. In other words, at the judgment. So
Yeah.
not fruitful in this life in the sense of having children, but fruitful at the judgment for having borne the truth, for having borne faithfulness, for having borne the right choices. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's actually then paralleled in chapter 4 by talking about the fact that the unjust have children, but they're not a benefit to them, that they are not fruitful. This
Right.
kind of turns on its head the way we normally think about these things. We talked about this at the beginning of the show, that like to have many children is a blessing and to not have children is a curse. And you see that, for instance, in Genesis, when Rachel finally has her child, she says, God has taken away my disgrace. Like there's the sense that not having children is a sign of having something against you by God. And the author of Wisdom is saying maybe, but not necessarily. And because it's not necessarily the case, we have to be really careful about how we judge this.
As I pointed out earlier, that a long life is often synonymous with faithfulness to God. And then you pointed out that many offspring can serve as a sign of God's favor. It's interesting that gets put right in the midst, or that put into tension right in the midst of this conversation about chastity and adultery. Like, we're still having these things contrasted, and now we're applying it here to children and to family life. And it's interesting to me that it talks about like almost the good fruits of chastity and the bad effects of adultery, because we often think of, speak of children metaphorically as the fruit of the family. So there are other good fruits that can come from the just man or just woman. But the problem for the children is not necessarily something that they caused. Right. So the problem that they have is their poor soil and root system, essentially, that they're planted in. That, these seedlings are unable to really take the right kind of root system. They're not able to gain the firm hold that they need. And in that context, with shallow roots and the trials of life, they're blown about. They're shaken by the wind. There's a rabbi quoted in the Jewish annotated Apocrypha is saying, whose wisdom exceeds their works is like a tree with many branches and few roots. The wind comes and easily uproots it. Mm-hmm. And whose works exceed their wisdom is like a tree with few branches, but many roots. No matter how many winds come, they cannot move it from its place. So for the children of the unjust, it's not entirely their fault. It's something they have inherited.
Yeah.
But it is certainly a factor of their growth and can pose a lot of difficulties in their lives.
That idea that these are not static categories is important here. So we could even say that somebody might be at a disadvantage, but that wouldn't stop them, for instance, from being offered the path of wisdom and choosing the path of wisdom. At any given point, anybody could choose to follow the path of wisdom. And that's ultimately the great hope. Whatever the formative inheritance we have, whatever the soil that we're in, we can make a change. We're not a tree. We can make a change. We can get up and go. And that means that we can be planted in different soil. And that's a blessing, and that's an opportunity for everyone. Chapter 4, the balance of chapter 4, the end of this passage that we're looking at, closes with the idea that an early death is actually a sign of God's care, a sign of God's mercy, a sign of God's goodness. And that, I mean, that's a little counterintuitive. We'd normally think of a long life as a sign of God's blessing. But again, the author here is trying to say, in a world as twisted as ours, in a world as upside down as ours, your normal assumptions about what is good and what is bad might be turned on their head also.
Yeah.
And here is a token. The just man, his life is robbed by the unjust. That is actually a mercy. And it reminds me of that line from St. Paul about being absent from the body and being present with the Lord.
We were talking about this off air, and how St. Paul deals with this. He talks about how it's better for him to be with Christ, but for now he's here, and so this thinking comes through in several places. But in 2 Corinthians in particular, he says, "We are confident, yes, well pleased, rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord." So in Christian theology, it's when we are both soul and body, we're material and immaterial, but that there's this sense in which when we are separated, where else would we go but to be in God's presence? The Navarre Bible points out that in Wisdom of Solomon, there's kind of a nuance here when it comes to this question of long life and serving God. And it says, in this context, premature death is far from being a punishment. It is a sign of God's love that he should reward the soul early and save him from affliction and grief. So while the nuance might be a little different, there is some similarity with other parts of Scripture. And the Jewish annotated Apocrypha calls this sort of thing that we're talking about reciprocal justice. And like, this theme is not simply unique to Wisdom of Solomon. It was taken up by other Hellenized Jews at the time, according to the Jewish annotated Apocrypha, like Philo and Josephus. But also what comes to mind is Proverbs chapter 1, verse 31. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their way and be sated with their own devices. Like, we're going to get what we put in, sort of, so to speak. And so what we do in this life matters, not just in this life, but also beyond. And this is no less true of the righteous man who dies young.
Given the way the Old Testament normally talks about these things, to see an early death considered a mercy or a sign of God's grace, it New Testaments the Old Testament. It's St. Paul's, like, this revelation here, and you can see how those concepts are related to each other. That there is a New Testament perspective that would be exemplified by a person like Saint Ignatius and all the other martyrs, telegraphed here in the Old Testament. This is a worldview that kind of like carries over. It's a bridge between these two worlds, and it comes from the conflict between the just and the unjust. It comes from a conflict, this antagonism that's between a godly way of looking at the world, a wise way of looking at the world, and an ungodly or a foolish way of looking at the world. And this tension that we experience between the two of them is an expression of what's sometimes called two ways theology, that there's like a good way and a bad way. And you can see this, it's all the way back in Deuteronomy with Moses's offer to the people, like, here's one path and here's another path.
Right.
You see it again in Josiah with the discovery of the book of Deuteronomy in the temple, or that part of the Deuteronomic code. You see it again with Ezra and his reforms, where the Jews come back from captivity and he reads the law to them, and it's kind of like, you're used to operating this way, now let me show you how God wants you to operate. So it's like, on the one hand and on the other hand, this kind of like on the one hand and on the other hand is everywhere in this period in particular. It's telegraphed in the Old Testament, it's present there, but it becomes like an operative way of looking at the world in this sort of Second Temple period, in this period that we're looking at here. And you see it in the early church all over the place. In the popular patristic series that St. Vlad's puts out, there's an actual collection on the two ways that is a study of this in several texts. And it's just like it's universal in the way the early church thinks about the Christian life, about the ethic of the Christian life. And it's exemplified by this book, The Wisdom of Solomon.
Yeah. It also strikes me that Jesus says this as well.
Yeah.
When he talks about entering through the narrow gate, and then he talks about two paths as well. He says that wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, but narrow is the gate and small is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. And I think there's sometimes a reading of that thinks that just means that very few people are saved, and that's the takeaway from the message. But I don't think that's what Jesus is getting at here. He's saying that there's a broad and easy road, and then there's a difficult road, and the difficult and narrow road is actually the one to be preferred.
Right.
And so Jesus is running with this same idea too. There are two paths, the easy path and the hard path, and you should choose this path because this is the one that at the end of that path is life.
Well, I mean, that's exactly in his statement about denying oneself and picking up your cross and following him. We think of that maybe in sentimental terms, but to pick up an instrument of torture and death and follow Jesus implies that it might be rough and your life might be cut short. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing about that says it's going to be easy.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to ride my typical hobby horse for half a second. As we close, before we close, thinking about these two ways and the examples from Deuteronomy, the example of Moses there, the example of the Josiah in the book of Deuteronomy, the example of Ezra, even the example of the early church. And that is that there is a sense in which all of this is made possible by the one technology of the book. And I want to say this because I think sometimes we fail to appreciate this. In the West, in evangelical circles that have been formed sociologically by the printed book, it's really easy to forget what a gift that is and what a blessing that is. And also all the consequences of that, some of which are not always a blessing. But books are ubiquitous. I'm sitting in a room with literally 2,000 of them, and it's not hard to just kind of look past them and only think about content or whatever. Yeah. The actual thing, the book, is not that interesting compared to the ideas in them. But that's not really true. If it weren't for that physical thing, you couldn't actually get the message at all. And what you see in the finding of the book in Josiah's story is something that was lost, and a set of ideas that was lost is now suddenly found again in a physical thing that can then be read and offered to the people. And Ezra does the same thing. Ezra comes back from captivity with the people, and it's not like he just stands up on the dais and repeats a bunch of ideas. He reads to them from a book.
Yeah.
And if you go back to First Maccabees, when we covered that in a recent episode in our last series, when the Israelites, when the Judahites are trying to figure out what is the right course to take, they consult the scriptures. And again, it's not the same way we normally think about a bunch of guys in a Bible study or something. It is a reader reading from a book that none of these people have access to tell them what to do or not do. And what this tells us, and we should be humble enough to recognize this, is that we're dependent on this interesting little technology that is, paper, pulp, and ink, or in their case, parchment and ink, that we're dependent on that to one degree or another. And in the Orthodox Church, we have our own version of maybe not getting this. And that is that we rarely, you don't find many Orthodox Christians taking their Bible to church with them.
Sure.
They don't need to. The scriptures are read from from the pulpit or from the ambo. And
Right.
so as a result of that, there's kind of a maybe of a lack of appreciation of the technology for the book that has its own problems or its own sources in the Orthodox world. But wherever we go, whether it's in the evangelical world, the Protestant world, the Catholic world, the Orthodox world, we are all, in order to follow the faithful path, dependent on somebody reading to us or our reading the right path, reading to us about the right path. And we're doing it right now as we think about the wisdom of Solomon. These ideas would be lost to us, and their specific expression would be lost to us if they weren't captured by a scribe, a writer, copied again and again and again and again and again until it could finally end up on a printing press and printed again and again and again and again until it could finally land in our laps today. That is like, you want to talk about providence. You want to talk about the mystery of God's goodness and God's grace. The fact that words that were written that long ago can come to us today and inspire us to move one direction over another direction is kind of amazing. And we should be humbled by it.
Yeah, it really is. And speaking of books, where would this show be without a reference to Jerome?
I was just wondering that.
He used this passage we covered today to encourage weary Christians. And he said, "Yes, we weep for the dead, but only those who have tumbled down into Gehenna. When we leave this life, however, we will be accompanied by a great host of angels, and Christ himself will come out to meet us. We should be sad if our lives in this earthly tomb were to go on for too long."
Wow.
Thanks for tuning in this week. If you find this study helpful, visit badbooksofthebible.com and sign up for email updates or follow us on Twitter. You might share this episode on Facebook or send a mass email to all your friends promising them the blessings of a good life for all listeners. You might even consider taking out a loan to buy a billboard to advertise the show. I'm Jamie Bennett.
And I'm Joel Miller.
And you've been listening to Bad Books of the Bible,
a production of Ancient Faith Radio. Come back next week when we talk about judgment and the king and find out, what does Solomon have to do with the book called The Wisdom of Solomon?